Hello, everyone. So today I'm actually going to be talking about a topic that is really at the heart and center of my dissertation. So if you're interested in my dissertation and want to know a little bit more about what that argued, then hopefully you'll find this interesting. It is going to be a little bit more of an academic talk. So just keep that in mind. So the paper is titled How to Argue for Belief, Credence, Dualism. I'm going to explain what that is, but the main point of my dissertation was to defend belief, credence, dualism, and then also kind of explore different implications of belief, credence, dualism. And I did, graduate a couple years ago, but a lot of my research since has also really focused on belief, credence, dualism. So just a brief background, many epistemologists, traditional epistemologists, basically see belief as a three-part attitude you could take towards a proposition, or there's three, maybe a better way of putting it, three different attitudes you can take towards a proposition. You can believe it, effectively saying it's true. You can withhold belief on it. You're agnostic. You're undecided on whether it's true. So, I withhold belief on whether there's an even number of hairs on my head, or you can disbelieve it, which effectively amounts to saying that it's false. And so we have these three attitudes, but look, I believe maybe that my coffee is cold right now, and I believe that it'll be sunny tomorrow. And I also believe that 1 + 1 = 2, right? But I'm more confident that 1 + 1 = 2 than I am in either of those other things. And so some epistemologists have said, look, just saying there's only these three attitudes that we can take towards any proposition, that's not going to capture the full story. So some of you have probably, heard me say this before, but that's why epistemologists bring in credences. Credences are basically our confidence level, or you could think about it like a subjective probability, and they're measured from 0 to 1. 0 is certainty a proposition is false. 1 is certainty that a proposition is true. And you can have all these various credences in between. So my credence will be sunny tomorrow is probably about 0.9. My credence 1 + 1 = 2 is 1 or very close to 1. My credence that there's an even number of hairs in my head is 0.5, right? So we have beliefs and we have credences. And there's been a lot of questions about the relationship between these two attitudes, partially because sometimes people will just sort of adopt one framework or the other and kind of ignore the other one. And, there's this whole formal epistemology program built up around credences, traditional epistemology program brought up around beliefs. And I want to see these two different sort of branches of epistemology talking to each other more. And so that's one reason I think this is a really interesting question. And sort of just setting things up here, as you can see on the handout, there's basically 5 views of the relationship between belief and credence. And there's these 4 questions, and they'll all answer at least some of these questions differently. So the first view is belief eliminativism. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. That's the view that beliefs don't exist at all. They're just sort of this leftover from folk psychology. And most belief eliminatists might say, some people are eliminativists about all attitudes, but for our purposes here, most of the people we're thinking about think we only have credences and not beliefs. So beliefs just don't exist. Then there's the credence first view. So the credence first view thinks that beliefs and credences both exist. However, they argue that beliefs reduce to credences. So there are beliefs, they're just a certain kind of credence. And the credence first view, as I note here, really splits into 2 further views. One view says that belief is credence 1. So when you believe something, what it is to believe something is to have credence 1 in it, or belief reduces to credence 1. And then the threshold view says that belief is credence above some threshold, but that threshold is less than 1. It's often greater than 0.5, although I guess it doesn't have to be. Some people think the threshold could change with context. Okay, that's the credence first view. Then there's dualism. So dualism is actually the view that I'm going to be defending and that I defend in my dissertation. And that's the view that beliefs and credences both exist, and they're not reducible to each other. They're equally fundamental. So we have beliefs, we have credences, and neither reduces to the other. Then there's the belief first view. This is the view that credences reduce to beliefs. So credences are a kind of belief. Often on the belief first view, credences are beliefs about probabilities, that they could be beliefs. There's ways that view is tweaked, which we'll get into later. And then finally, there's the Credo Elimination view. So on the Credo Elimination view, credences don't exist. Some people that argue against this view are like, oh, the formal epistemologists just made this thing up, credences. No one actually really has credences. They're totally psychologically unrealistic. All we have is beliefs. Okay. So my goal today is to argue for belief credence dualism based on the functional roles of belief and credence. So I want to argue that beliefs play certain functional roles that credences can't, and credences play certain functional roles that belief can't. Before I get into that, I'll be giving some quick arguments against belief and credo eliminativism. But I'm really going to be focusing on this idea that we shouldn't try to reduce beliefs to credences, and we shouldn't try to reduce credences to beliefs. So I will, at the beginning kind of be providing some counterexamples to the other 5 views, but I do want to kind of give a positive case for dualism as well, and sort of try to tell a story about why dualism is true. And that's, again, going to have to do with these different functional roles that belief and credence play. So I will note this is kind of a big picture paper, and it's kind of combining a lot of my previous work, sort of giving a bird's eye perspective on a lot of my research. And it's actually from the 2nd chapter of my dissertation, which I published like little parts of. I actually took like sections and like expanded them into papers. But I actually never really published like the main kind of argument of the chapters. This is probably the paper that's closest to kind of mimicking that main argument. So you could see the title of this paper is like, Why Liz is a Dualist, if you wanted to. So briefly, as our road ahead, section 2 will briefly examine some reasons to reject eliminativist views and also reject the belief is credence 1 view. And then in section 3, I'll just sort of explain a little bit more about the reductionist views. Section 4 will explain why I reject the belief first view. And then section 5 will explain why I reject the credence first view. And in both of the sections 4 and 5, I'll be kind of explaining, I think there are actually cases of irrational agents that I think actually serve as counterexamples to the belief in credence first view. But I do want to make a positive case for dualism, and so I'm not just going to be interested in rationality and irrationality, but also in the roles that belief and credence play in a rational agent as well. Okay, so let's move on to section 2. Whoops. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about these eliminativist views, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them. So note, belief eliminativism just requires a very extensive error theory about our common sense psychology, much of our everyday discourse. It's very common to say like, I believe this, or I don't believe that, or I'm undecided about that. And so it just really, just saying there's no beliefs at all, I think it's just, it's going to be a pretty radical view, a pretty radical revision of kind of our common sense view. And it does kind of seem like there are things that we just straight up believe. It doesn't seem like every single belief is just a credence, like there's no beliefs at all. So that was super brief, but that's all the time I have to go into for that. Feel free to comment if you have more questions or want to hear more about why I don't like belief eliminativism. I'll spend a little bit more time on credo eliminativism, but not too much more. And the thought behind credo eliminativism is kind of similar to what we already talked about. If all there is belief, withholding, and disbelief, we can't capture this idea that we're more confident in some things that we believe than in others. Beliefs are just super coarse-grained. There's really just 3 belief-like attitudes. And this just seems too coarse-grained to capture all the nuanced things that are going on in our heads, our various levels of confidence, probability judgments, all of that. And I think too, it's easy to see credence in a very narrow way. It has to be this precisely point valued subjective probability, but I actually think it's better to interpret credence in a relatively broad way. So credence can include things like confidence levels, what some philosophers call partial beliefs. You can have fuzzy or fuzzy credences or interval credences or imprecise credences. So your credences don't always have to be precise. You could be more confident in A than in B, even if you're not, be able to say the exact probability of either one of those. And so I think given this kind of broader understanding of credence, I think it's pretty plausible that we have credences. And also, I don't think actually anyone really defends credo eliminativism, because they'll say we don't have credences, but we have partial beliefs. And then I'm like, okay, well, for my purposes, that is a credence, And I also think some people think we don't have any precise credences at all, but I think we do have precise credences, and this is often when we have precise evidence. So you can think about a coin flip. You have a 0.5 credence the coin will land heads. Rolling a dice, you have a 1 in 6 credence that the dice will land a 5. And then you can also think of cases where you proportion your credence to a specific statistic that you're given. Whether that's, you check Amazon and there's like an 85% chance your package arrives today, so you have 0.85 credence, or, support sports statistics. I think there's a lot of examples of cases where we proportion our credences to a specific statistic, and then we have a relatively precise credence. So I think given this kind of broader understanding of what a credence is, and this need to have an attitude that's a little more fine-grained, I think it's very plausible that we have credences. Okay. The third view I wanted to address here is the belief as credence one view. So this is the view that, we do have credences and beliefs, but beliefs just are credences of one. There's things that people say in favor of this view, and, belief and credence one are similar in certain ways. They have similar kind of functional profiles. When you believe something or have credence one in it, you tend to rule out the alternative possibility. So if I believe it will rain tomorrow, that attitude is associated with ruling out the possibility that it won't rain tomorrow, similar with credence one. However, there's a number of standard objections against this view. First of all, I think there's just some intuitive counterexamples to it. So there's lots of things that we believe we're not 100% sure of. We already talked about some examples of this, that it, will be sunny tomorrow, that my car is parked in front of my house, that, this number 1 seed in this tournament will beat this number 16 seed. There's lots of things like that I believe, but there is a chance I'm wrong. I'm not 100% sure. And it also, similarly, it just can't capture this really intuitive idea that we're more confident in some things that we believe than in others. You can believe 2 things, but be more confident in one than the other. The belief as credence one view can't capture that, because all beliefs, you have the same credence in them, credence one. Furthermore, it does seem to conflict with decision theory. So according to decision theory, you should have a credence one. If you have a credence one in something, you should be willing to take any bet on it, no matter what the stakes are. But there's lots of things we believe that we wouldn't take any bet on, right? So I believe I was born in Kansas, but I wouldn't take a bet that would give me $1 if I was born in Kansas, and I'll be tortured for the rest of my life if I wasn't born in Kansas. So I believe I was born in Kansas. That's not changing, but I'm saying I do still believe that, but I'm not taking that bet, right? The main response that the credence one people give to this is that there's some kind of context sensitivity about belief. So in the context before I'm offered the bet, I do believe that, and then being offered the bet basically changes my belief, because I'm not willing to make that bet anymore. So basically, in general, you give up a belief when you're confronted with certain kinds of bets, even if those bets don't constitute evidence against that belief. I'm just going to leave that there as a reductio. I know some people like this contextualist view of belief, but I'm not a big fan of contextualism. So for the sake of time, I'm going to say I'm not satisfied with that response, but that is a common response that a lot of people like. It's also maybe worth noting that some people like to have this view in which belief is certainty, but certainty is different than credence one, and the subtle distinctions that they're making. I think 2 things here. So I think, first of all, this view does suffer from many of the same issues. So there's many things that we believe that we're not certain of, right? I gave a lot of examples. I think similar examples to the credence one also work for the certainty thing, and we're more confident in some things that we believe than in others, but you can't capture that if belief is certainty. But I think furthermore, unless you're really clear about what the relationship is between certainty and credence, this answer doesn't really even give us an answer about the relationship between belief and credence. It just tells us something about belief and certainty. But if we don't know what the relationship between certainty and credence is, other than certainty isn't credence one, I don't think this really helps. Okay. Here is a newer objection to the belief as credence one view. I actually stole this from a paper that I refereed, but I really think this is a really cool objection. So, and that objection is this: the belief as credence one view, it actually undermines many of the motivations that are given for positing credences in the first place. So I started off by saying we have beliefs, we have credences, both kind of when I was explaining what those are, and then also when I was kind of arguing against the eliminativist views, I was giving these kind of motivations, and I've given these spiels a lot. Like, look, we're more confident in some things we believe than in others. You could also think about a case where you believe P, but then you get some more evidence for P. And then your belief doesn't change, but something changes, presumably like your credence, right? Or you believe P and you get a little bit of evidence against P. You keep believing P. Again, what changes? Your credence. So credence can help us capture these like subtle changes in evidence that don't change what our beliefs. And so I think the thought here is like part of the reason we even say that we want to say that credences are a thing is because they're this fine-grained attitude that helps us distinguish between various kinds of beliefs. Beliefs we're maximally confident, beliefs we're moderately confident in, etc. But if belief is credence one, we don't need these distinctions, right? We're equally confident in everything we believe. So, I'm not going to sit here and just write a paper on why belief is credence one is false. That's not the main point of this video. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that. I realize this is short, but I really think there's something that is a really big cost to your view if you're reducing beliefs to something and then you're undermining many of the reasons for positing that thing you're reducing beliefs to in the first place. So that's kind of the main reasons I reject the belief is credence one view. Okay, moving on to section 3. This is about just briefly about reductionism and some of the reductionist views. I probably won't go into this a lot here, but one kind of question is, what do we mean by reduction? We're talking about basically these two views, credences reducing to beliefs or beliefs reducing to credences, but what does reduce mean? And I think there's really 3 main options. It could be identity. So A reduces to B if and only if A is numerically identical to B. The main problem here is that identity is symmetrical. So if I am identical to the philosophy professor teaching the certain section of critical thinking this semester, we're the same person. There's not, we're like there's a symmetry right there between us. But reduction is supposed to be asymmetrical. One thing is reducing to another. So one is more fundamental than the other. So some people still really want to try to make this identity thing work, but I do think that's a problem. So 2 other views that are not symmetrical would be reduction as supervenience. So A supervenes on B if and only if there's no difference in A without there being a difference in B. And then there's also grounding, which is supervenience plus, basically. So A reduces to B if and only if A is grounded in B. So it's normally like this supervenience plus metaphysical fundamentality and explanatory priority. Maybe the grounding option is the best option. I'm not really going to take a stand on this here, but just sort of note those as options. And if you think there's other good options for how we might understand reduction, you can let me know in the comments. But yeah, I do think it's worth kind of thinking a little bit more about what we mean by reduction here. Okay, so moving on from that, we kind of talked at the beginning about these 5 views, but then this view reduces to 2 views. So we sort of ruled out this view, and then the belief is credence one view. And so dualism is kind of what we're aiming at, right? But it leaves us with 2 views. There's a threshold view and there's the belief first view. So we're really going to focus on mainly those 2 views right now. So what is the belief first view? This is the view that credences are beliefs with particular contents. So when you have a credence, what that means is you have a belief about a probability, or it could be a belief about an epistemic modal. I'll explain what that is. So, maybe you have a 0.5 credence that a coin will land heads. What that is it's a belief. The belief that the probability that the coin will land heads is 0.5. Normally, I think the most plausible candidate for the type of probability is epistemic probability, which is some kind of evidence relative probability. But could also be a belief with an epistemic modal. So epistemic modals are words like probably, may, can, might. And so, you might think my high credence it will rain tomorrow. That's an epistemic modal belief, the belief that it will probably rain tomorrow, where probably is an epistemic modal. And I think the main challenge for the dualists from this belief first view, I'm calling it the belief first challenge. And Andrew Moon and I actually wrote a paper sort of answering some objections from the belief first view. I ultimately do reject the belief first view. But you can think of the challenge like this: if we have beliefs about probabilities, why do we in addition need to posit credences? It makes much more sense just to say we have beliefs and we have probability beliefs, and that's it. So that's sort of the challenge I'm going to try to meet in the next section. Okay, the second view that also presents a challenge to the dualist is called the threshold view. This is the view that belief reduces to a credence above some threshold, but that threshold is less than 1. So I think I talked about this a little bit already. You might say like the threshold is a fixed threshold, 0.75, let's say, or someone suggested like the inverse of the golden ratio, which is like 0.6 something. So there's been various like fixed thresholds proposed, or you might have a view like a 0.5 could be the threshold, or again, the threshold could vary with stakes or context. So it might be that everything that you have at least a 0.75 credence in or above, you believe. So that's a threshold view, and this can capture the idea that we're more confident in some things that we believe than others. And I think this view sort of presents this challenge for dualism, which is this: if we have both a belief in P and a credence in P, what is the use of the belief? So the credence is much more accurate, it's more fine-grained, it can better sort of capture our attitude towards the proposition. And this suggests that beliefs are either superfluous, they're just this extra thing that we don't really need, or they're inaccurate. And so then we should just trust our credences. And so, you could maybe try to use this to motivate some kind of belief eliminativism, but I think a lot of people will take this threshold or this credence first view instead and say, I mean, we do have beliefs, but what beliefs are just these threshold passing credences. So I want to try, and by the way, that's called the Bayesian challenge. So I want to try to answer both the belief first and the Bayesian challenge in the rest of this paper. Okay, so let's start with the belief first. I think actually both of these views suffer counterexamples from certain kinds of irrational thinkers. And the relationship between belief and credence, it's not a normative claim. It's not a claim about rationality. It's just a claim about what reduces to what. So it should be able to explain both cases of rationality and cases of irrationality. But I think the belief first view, you can actually give counterexamples when you think about certain irrational thinkers. So suppose someone's irrational. It's not at all clear, given that they're irrational, what would prevent them from having a credence that's different than their beliefs about probability or their epistemic modal beliefs. So, this person might have a credence of 0 in something, but still think it's possible. Maybe they are engaging in a kind of wishful thinking or something. Or alternatively, they might believe something's impossible, but have a non-zero credence in it. So have a credence in it that's above 0. And so, yeah, maybe these are irrational combinations of attitudes, but should we really say they're impossible? And I think especially if we have kind of infinite space, like probability space is involved, there might even be cases where you have like a non-zero credence in P, but you should believe that P is impossible. So it might not even always be irrational. You could also think of like other, like maybe more real life cases as well. So think about someone who's paranoid or delusional or just really jealous or something. And maybe they have like a really high credence their partner is cheating on them. They're very confident that their partner is cheating on them, but they know at the same time that they really don't have good evidence for this. Their evidence doesn't support a high probability that their partner is cheating on them. And so they believe that the epistemic probability that their partner is cheating is low. So again, epistemic probability, it's relative to your evidence. They're saying, I don't have good evidence for this. And they might even admit, I know the probability of this is low, but I just can't shake this high credence that my partner is cheating on me. Okay, so those are some example, I think, counterexamples to the belief first view from irrationality. But I also want to think about rational agents and think about what's the role for credence that may not be played by a probability belief. Okay. So I think probability beliefs are useful, and we do have probability beliefs, and they're useful for a couple of reasons. I think first of all, when we're undergoing certain kinds of probabilistic reasoning, so we're trying to start from some probabilities and reason to other probabilities, it's much easier to reason with probability beliefs. And there's actually been a lot of work on like whether we could even do that kind of reasoning with credences. So Julia Staffel has an interesting paper on that. I think it's called Can There Be Reasoning with Degrees of Belief? So I think probability beliefs, because of the way the probability is part of the attitude, it's not in the content of the credence, I think they're very useful for probabilistic reasoning. I am also sympathetic to the idea that our credences, when they're rational, they'll probably closely track our beliefs about epistemic probabilities, because then they'll be connected to our evidence, which is our beliefs about epistemic probabilities are connected to. And I also think probability beliefs, they can allow for a certain kind of flexibility. So it might be sometimes useful to form different beliefs about different conceptions of probability. So you might know the objective probability of P is either 1 or 0, like in a mathematical case, you know this theorem's probability is either 1 or 0, but because you don't know whether the theorem is true or false, the epistemic probability is 0.5. So probability beliefs allow us this like kind of flexibility that I think is really useful. However, I think there's a unique role that credence plays that beliefs about epistemic probability can't play. And there's really like, it's kind of like this threefold view. So the first is that creatures who lack certain concepts or who lack certain cognitive capacities, it seems like they can have credences, but they may not have the concept of probability, or they may not have the cognitive sophistication to form the probability beliefs, these more complex beliefs. So this objection has actually been pushed. It was originally pushed by Frankish, who I cite here. And, you know, Andrew Moon and I think we did our best to kind of respond to this and say, well, either they don't have credences at all, or they do have the concept of probability, but I'm not totally, I'm still on the fence about that. And I mention it here because I do think it kind of fits well with this general rule for credence, which is that it's cognitively thinner than a probability belief. And I'll say more about that soon, but let me just go through these other two really quickly. So there's also creatures who form a credence in a very complicated proposition. And that proposition is right on the edge of what they can grasp. So one example I've given is he said that she said that he knows that he believes that she said that he's sure that she's mad at him. And it's like, wait, what? You kind of have to like think about that for a second. So you might like barely grasp that and form like a 0.5 credence in it or something, but you can't form the more complicated belief that the probability of da 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 is 0.5. And so again, credences let you can form a credence in that because it's cognitively thinner, because you're not forming a belief about a probability. The 0.5 part of the credence is in the attitude. And then the only thing you have to grasp is the more simple, I guess, proposition. So I actually have a paper where I defend this in more detail, but again, I think it fits with this general rule for credence. And then finally, I think, and I mean, maybe this kind of gets at the general thought, it allows us to express uncertainty and to be uncertain without having to represent that uncertainty in the content of what we're believing. So that lets us, it helps us represent uncertainty in a less cognitively demanding way. It also enables us to have a belief in a credence with the same content. So you can believe it will rain tomorrow, have a 0.5 credence it will rain tomorrow. It's not like you're believing one thing and then you're believing something with a different content. And so in general, I think this idea that credences are cognitively thinner in some way, whereas probability beliefs are cognitively thicker in some way, I think makes good sense of, I mean, the distinction, I think, between probability belief and credence, but also these various kinds of creatures or people that seems like they can have credences, but they can't meet this more cognitively demanding thing that is what probability beliefs require. So I do think a belief firster would probably just say like, this appeal to cognitive thickness is just question begging. It's my view. I think that, you know, probability beliefs and credences are equally cognitively thick. And I think, I mean, it kind of just puts us at a difficult point dialectically, because this is just really fundamental to how and I think many others in this debate view beliefs, probability beliefs and credences. And so at some point I wondered, like, are we really disagreeing about what credences are? Or are we just like talking about different things? I don't know. So I'm not necessarily convinced that this is going to convince a belief firster, but I do think this is kind of explaining again why Liz is a dualist, right? And I do think there's something to be said for this idea that there's a difference in cognitive thickness, and that gives credences this unique role that probability beliefs can't play. Okay, let's move on to section 5, which is against the threshold view. So recall the threshold view. The threshold view is the view that beliefs, sorry, I'm just adding this to my notes really quick. It's the view that beliefs are credences above some threshold, and that threshold is less than 1 and often greater than 0.5, although I don't think it has to be. So in that, again, that threshold can be fixed or it can vary with context. So that's a threshold view. I think first of all, there is again a counterexample from irrational thinkers. So I think there are certain cases of, double-mindedness or self-deception or acrasia when you believe or do something that you think you shouldn't. And I think these are just best explained by the dualist. So suppose that someone has an irrational belief that they can't shake. Again, maybe they're paranoid that their partner is cheating on them and they believe their partner is cheating on them, but they kind of acknowledge like, this is irrational and I have a low credence that this is true. So they realize this is poorly supported by their evidence and their credence kind of fits with their evidence, but they have this belief they can't shake. An alternative case might be a case where someone is convinced that believing something but having a low credence in it is the right response to their evidence. So some people have actually argued that, for those of you who are familiar with the preface paradox, that this is actually how we should view the conjunction of all of the claims in our book. We should believe it but have a low credence in it. There's other examples here as well I'm not going to go into. But you might genuinely believe this, but let's just concede for now that they're mistaken about what rationality requires. So maybe they are in fact irrational or something. So in both of these cases, it seems like they really do have a low credence. Their credence is not a maximal credence. We already talked about the belief is credence 1 view. It's also not threshold passing. And so it's not totally clear how the credence first here could explain these cases of belief and low credence. They might try to say like they have 2 credences in the same proposition at the same time, but really that possibility has not been discussed in the literature very much and just seems really weird. And these are like pretty basic everyday cases of irrationality. So it would be surprising if they had to appeal to something so extreme to explain these kinds of cases. However, the dualist has a really natural explanation for what's going on here. Like, look, belief and credence are these distinct and irreducible attitudes. So of course, especially if the agent is irrational, they can significantly come apart. You can believe something and have a low credence in it. So this argument, again, is spelled out in more detail in a paper I have with Peter Tan. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how I think we can answer the Bayesian challenge. What is the role that beliefs play that high credences can't? And I think what that role is we can kind of sum it up in that beliefs close off possibilities. So when you believe P, you're in some sense ruling out or closing off the possibility of not P. And it's not just in this like pretending way. You're not like, I'm gonna, be an actor, an actress, or I'm just gonna concede this for the sake of argument, but you believe P, who represent the world as P is true. So you're kind of ruling out not P in a mental or representational way. And that's gonna come up when I talk about an objection, maybe briefly at the end. But I think that high credences don't do that. So a high credence in P, what it does is it represents P as likely, but it nonetheless leaves open the possibility of not P. There's also, so you might wonder, what's the use of closing out possibilities in this way? And I think there's sort of two main uses for this. The first is just efficiency in reasoning. So we cannot be considering every error possibility that's always relevant to our reasoning. And so beliefs, they let us rule out possibilities, which just simplifies our reasoning. And when the stakes are low, so maybe we have a ton of evidence for P, of course it's not perfect, but it doesn't really matter if not P, so it makes sense to just suppose P for the sake of argument. Or we just have to make a decision really quickly so we don't have time to think through a bunch of alternative possibilities. Then it just makes sense to sort of treat P as true and represent the world such as P, not just kind of accept that P is true, but take P on board as true. And so you might think about like a soccer goalie and they have to make a quick decision about how to block something. They might just sort of represent the world such that, someone's coming from the left to kick the ball in a certain way, right? Instead of like thinking about the possibility of error and like reasoning through a decision table. No, they just got to make like a quick decision, right? You could think about like another case of like, you're in a battle and the enemy is upon you and you need to make a decision. That could actually be a high stakes case, but because you have to make such a quick decision, you might just kind of represent the world such that P is true. Another example I've given here is if you walk into your office and see your office mate's coat and backpack, you'll probably just represent the world such that as they're in the office today, you'll believe they're in the office. If your friend says, is so-and-so in the office, you'll say, yeah, of course. But if the stakes get really high and like the police are investigating a crime and they have to know everyone who's in the office, you're going to move to your credence and instead say, look, I'm not 100% sure. I don't know for sure, right? And so you'll express your non-extreme credence when answering the cops, moving from the belief reasoning to the credence reasoning. So moving from the low stakes to the high stakes often will prompt us to consider these alternative possibilities. That said, though, I don't think that beliefs only play the role of efficiency. And I think kind of intuitively, cognitively sophisticated agents, so maybe like an angel or like some agent that like really has these like this extra brain power, I think those kinds of agents that it's not difficult for them to consider lots of alternative possibilities, I think they would have beliefs too. So I think this kind of ruling out role that beliefs play isn't just for this purpose of simplification. And I think there's another role that beliefs play as well, and that's beliefs let us take a stand. They let us have a view of the world, and they let us remain steadfast in our commitments. So we might, even want to do this when we receive counter evidence against our commitments that lowers our credence. But if, beliefs just are high credences, it's not really clear how that amounts to taking a stand. And if we kind of are able to close off the possibility of not P and kind of hold on to that belief, that lets us kind of represent the world such as P, not be spineless in the face of disagreement or counter evidence. And again, it kind of can underlie a commitment. And Laura Bushak argues this. She has a cool recent paper about disagreement, how this fits, but also in her 2014 paper, she argues that this could also underlie certain kinds of moral or legal verdicts. So I think beliefs are useful both for this efficiency and simplification role, but I think also they kind of just let us take a stand, which is important for various reasons, including keeping our commitments, maybe including underlying moral legal verdicts, and just being able to have a view of the world, take a stand on the truth of something. That said, credences are useful as well. Credences give us a precise and accurate representation of our level of evidence. And when rational, they sort of track our exact level of evidential support as we kind of update them by conditionalization. And they also help us keep track of counter evidence. So when we have this commitment and we're like, I believe P, I'm committed to P, whatever, and then you get some counter evidence, it's good to a certain extent to keep that belief. But if your counter evidence just keeps going down and down and down and down and down, at some point you should give up your belief, and your credence can help you track when you should give up that belief. At the same time, it's nice to be able to continue in your commitment in light of the non-decisive counter evidence. And so your credence can track that non-decisive counter evidence, but you can kind of keep that belief. So you can keep something even though your credence goes down in light of the non-decisive counter evidence. Okay, cool. So just to kind of sum up, basically I have hopefully accomplished, or at least begun to accomplish, two goals. And that is to carve out a unique role for credence that beliefs cannot play, which is a cognitively less demanding way to represent uncertainty. But also, I think I've sort of discussed these two main answers to the Bayesian challenge. One has to do with simplification and efficiency, and the other has to do with remaining steadfast and having a view of the world. And what I want to do is sort of unify both of these camps into this fundamental role for belief, which is that it closes off the possibility of not P. And so I think this has actually pretty plausible result, which is that agents that are more cognitively sophisticated than us, they would have some beliefs, but less beliefs than we have, because they wouldn't need these beliefs that are only there to just simplify reasoning. There's sort of two outstanding objections. Maybe I'll just go through them super briefly. So the first is, why not acceptance? So when you accept P, you act as if P is true. And you might wonder, especially for this kind of efficiency rule, why can't we just act as if the proposition is true rather than believe it? And part of the answer is that I don't think, again, it's not this like pretending thing. Beliefs aren't there to just like let us pretend that P is true, whereas I think acceptance is much more of this pretendy thing. But beliefs have this mental and representational component. So it's not just I'm going to act as if P for some practical purpose, but I'm actually mentally representing P as true. And so I think beliefs plays roles that acceptance cannot, which is this representing the world such as P, letting us mentally take a stand on P, and also helping us not be spineless when we get counter evidence against P. The second objection is one I'm actually kind of still mulling over and thinking about. I think it's a really important objection. And that's the question of, well, when do we act on a belief versus acting on a credence? Like beliefs, maybe they close off possibilities, credences leave them open. But when do we act on one versus the other? And I do think when we talk about the simplifying role of belief, there's a really good answer. And that's that you act on your beliefs when the stakes are low or you have to make a quick decision, but credences are useful when the stakes are high or we have a lot of time to think through something. And so I think a further interesting question here is, what about these cases where we want to take a stand on something? And I think those could actually be really high stakes cases, but cases where it is appropriate to act on our beliefs. Maybe that belief underlies an important philosophical or political or ethical or even a religious commitment. So I don't want to say that beliefs are just only associated with low stakes and credences are just only associated with high stakes. But I think it's going to be a complicated story here where some beliefs, it probably is going to depend on the content of the belief, will be more associated with low stakes, but other beliefs where the content is really important to us, those may be beliefs that we can kind of maintain even in the face of high stakes. So either way, I hope you have a good sense of kind of what my dissertation was about and why I think beliefs don't just reduce to credences, and I don't think credences just reduce to beliefs. So thanks for listening.